I'm going to talk about building better soils with cover crops. And there's some contact info. There's a few Twitter accounts there you can see. And that's my personal one, the Great Plains Grazing one, and the K-State Agronomy one, and my email too if you want to follow up with any questions later about something specific. So I'll get the bad news out of the way first. We've been hard on soils and it shows. And these are just two pictures I took in Kansas. In the western part of the state, wind erosion tends to be a little more predominant. And then in the central part of the state, this one over here was taken right along some end rows. So out in the field, which you can't really see the edge of the field, the rest of the field looked pretty good, but these end rows looked terrible. And that just was dumping right down into a road ditch. I mean, that was just real loss. We know that along with sediment, nutrients transfer as well. So a lot of phosphorus can be in that sediment that's leaving the field. So it can be a real loss for agricultural production. I didn't include this picture, but I've done a lot of work sampling, looking at how eroded our soils are, how much topsoil they've lost. Now, you can also lose soil organic matter through increasing the respiration of microbes, which is basically tillage, for example. When you till up a soil, you really increase the microbes go crazy and they start decomposing soil organic matter. And so between that combination of accelerated respiration and accelerated erosion, about most soils in Kansas and actually around the U.S., most soils have lost about 50% of their topsoil. And we have a soil judging contest coming up here in town. We're talking about some soil pits that are open. And we have a soil pit that has lost all of its topsoil. So I know that that happens a lot of places too. We're farming the subsoil. That's just not a good thing for productivity. Now moving on, what can we do about it? So, reducing soil disturbance. So whether that's no-tilling all the time or whether that's starting to no-till for part of the rotation, that's a good thing for building up soil. Covering the soil surface, leaving residue on top or planting a cover crop to increase that residue cover is a good thing. You can kind of see in the background here, that's that same background picture, but this is a cover crop last fall when it was just coming up over the top of the soybean residue. And if I went out there today, I'm pretty sure all that soybean residue is going to be gone. It just doesn't last very long. So having this cover here in the spring, we've been getting a ton of rain just these past few days. I've been watching it. I think I'm not sure how this site, but this site's probably had 5 inches in maybe 4 or 5 days. So I'm glad that cover crop's there because it's on a slope. Increasing the diversity of a cropping system, that's known to increase soil organic matter. So there's an exception to that. Continuous corn actually increases soil organic matter too, but that's got its own flaw. That system has its own, problems perhaps with like pathogens or whatever. But if you increase the diversity of the cropping system by, taking it from, 2 crops or 3 crops, you can increase soil organic matter that way too. And adding more carbon to the system, just straight up adding more carbon. So if you're trying to increase soil organic matter, well, soil organic matter is about half or carbon, right? So if you add more carbon to the system by adding more plants to grow, harvest more, do more photosynthesis, you're going to add more carbon into the soil system. You can also do that through manure and compost in additions to a soil as well. And so the nice thing is cover crops kind of fill all of these things. And I won't go into any more detail on that because I think it's pretty obvious. So, definition of cover crops. So basically I'll just highlight the definition that Soil Science Society of America would give is that it's really for the soil to increase production, protection and soil improvement. And this has been known for a long time. I like to collect the old yearbooks of agriculture and Soils and Men books from way back. My oldest one it's I think 1895 is the oldest one that I have. And they talk about these concepts back then as well. So let's see. Again, soil improvement, protection from erosion. You can reduce compaction. Weed control, boy, that's probably the biggest topic go around right now is cover crops and weed control. Help break some disease and pest cycles. Again, if you're starting to diversify rotation, that helps a lot with that. And cycling of plant nutrients. And of course, legumes, this is sun hemp. It's a warm season legume that works pretty well for us in Kansas after wheat crop is a great legume. Fixes a lot of nitrogen. So this is a Phacelia plant here, and it's a pollinator species that people, I mean, it attracts in a lot of insects. And I was looking up one day the value of pollinators, and it says bees account for 15 billion in crop value. So you're probably familiar with the fact that people move bees around the country on purpose to go pollinate this crop or pollinate almonds in Arizona and things like that. So bees do a lot of services for agriculture. Okay, we're on the Great Plains grazing webinar right now, so I have to talk about grazing a little bit. And so boy, these are cattle grazing. I think this is probably wheat pasture, and this picture is muddy and there's water standing. Adding some cover crops in there. So if we pretend this is cover crops that they were grazing, but adding cover crops into a system, that's a great thing for maybe being able to rest some pastures, right? So I think there's opportunities for cover crops for grazing, and that's sure a big important subject in Kansas. And there's been other webinars on that topic. A person I would point you to that knows a lot about this would be Jamie Lynn Farney, who is an animal scientist and studies this a lot. Also, there's a Nebraska study that I really like too that talks about grazing livestock and soil properties. So there's a soil scientist involved with that project. So it's an animal scientist and soil scientist. Then they've got some corn stalks under a pivot, and they plant cover crops. And their early indication is that there's no impact on the soil properties, and that's kind of been shown several times, but I think they even show that it can maybe be of some benefit, so to have cattle on some grazing. And then these are sheep in a vineyard, and sometimes I go and speak, I speak about cover crops to a lot of different people, and the Kansas Grape Growers and Winemakers Association asked me to come and talk to them last year. And, cover crops for them can be part of a marketing tool to talk about their sustainability with their customers and, putting livestock on the bottle. It's an important thing. So across the agricultural sector, it's pretty hot topic and getting a lot of, I'd say, use and attention. So I like to get this out of the way. If you graze a cover crop, is it still a cover crop or is it a forage? Because it's not purely for the soil, right? I don't really care. The soil benefits either way as long as you go ahead and leave some cover. You can't graze this to nothing. And also here with these cattle here in the water, I mean, there are limitations. You don't really want to graze when it's saturated, right? That's bad as far as I realize you may not have choices on this, but from a soil perspective, that's going to cause compaction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sun hemp in the next few slides here. So it's like I said, I showed that picture where it's got the yellow flowers. It's a summer legume, and it's whether you do it, this is a solid stand here, or whether you have it in a mixture, it does do a great job. It's a kind of a tall plant, and it does do a great job of fixing nitrogen. So I think, it's in the several, I want to say, some of the studies, I think it can even fix up to maybe 100 pounds of nitrogen. Of course, it's going to be a range. Like, is it 50 to 100? And not all of it's going to be available to the next crop. We'd say about half is going to be available to the next crop once those nodules and once the plant tissue starts to decay. Ooh, that looks ugly. So I'll go ahead and put this on there. Covers improve soil. So this is a study we published a few years back, and so this was the title: Summer Cover Crops Fix Nitrogen, Increase Crop Yield, and Improve Soil Crop Relationships. And there's a citation if you want it. So this is the no cover crop. So I'll tell you about the rotation. It was wheat, sorghum rotation. This study, when we took the soil samples, had been in place for 15 years. And so there's a no cover crop. The black bars are also the top 3 inches. 7.5 centimeters is the top 3 inches. So the no cover crop here, late maturing soybean. So I believe this study was, it was started in the 90s. So the late maturing soybean, that was, a thought was, well, let's use that as a cover crop. And so they picked a maturity group that didn't set pods, and they terminated it, and so it was used as a cover crop. Sun hemp was used. And so what I want to show is, you can see the organic matter in the top 3 inches is a lot higher, and these two aren't different from each other. So if you just want to say, the cover crop, average those numbers, 3.5 versus 2.8. So this is no-till, so it might have, we don't actually have the soil samples from the beginning of the study, so I can't tell you if this 2.8 used to be lower or used to be higher. I don't really know, but I do know that that it definitely statistically increased over time. And I'll show you what that does to some other things too. And so raising soil organic matter can be done by eliminating tillage. I already talked about diversity and crop rotation, more days when plants are growing. But this one I want to talk about over time. And I say 5 years maybe. I mean, I can tell you that in a span of like 3 years, I've never seen a soil organic matter move. I've seen other properties move, and I'll tell you about that. But I haven't seen soil organic matter itself change. And also, it's easier, or you can raise soil organic matter faster in a soil that's, I say clay, but basically more fine particles. So a silt loam or silty clay loam, and the clayier textures, clay loam, silty clay, it's going to happen faster. You can raise it more because there's physical protection of the clay particles binding together with soil organic matter. Maybe some of it's being glued by the fungal hyphae as well, but you get better aggregates, and on the inside of those aggregates is where you'll get some physical protection of the carbon. Just gets kind of locked up in the middle there, versus a sandy soil. So sandy soils, it's harder to raise soil organic matter in a sandy soil. And in a place where there's more precipitation, you're going to have more productivity usually, and so you can get more organic matter sequestered as well. Okay, soil scientists always go on about soil organic matter, right? Why is it so important? Because it relates to a lot of other things. So here's cumulative water infiltration in inches. Then this is time over here on the x-axis. And so what you see is after 180 minutes, so we sit there and measure these things. You can see at first we take them more frequently, and over time we start to stretch out the interval. So 3 hours. In 3 hours where there was no cover crop, again, no tilled for 15 years, wheat sorghum rotation, 2 inches of water soaked in. Now, that sounds like a lot, but I want to point out that when we do this, we use these rings that we drive into the ground, and we pour water very carefully on top. So we're not allowing runoff to happen. This is solely what's going in. So you can't take this number and run with it and say, oh, this should infiltrate 6 inches in 3 hours. If there was no slope, maybe. But in this situation, we're trying to compare these three things. But it took 2 hours, so 2 inches of water in 3 hours. The late maturing soybean should be a black box, a triangle there, that took 4 inches of water, and the sun hemp took 6 inches of water. So that's just a huge difference. And what I think is interesting about this is that it's a cover crop every other year for 15 years. These two were. We didn't have a cover crop every year. So having a cover crop in there half of the time in this rotation was a good thing for the soil. So, yep. Then I want to show you this. Okay, so what's happening in this picture? This is a bear licking honey off of a window. In nature, this is a Malayan sun bear. In nature, honey is their favorite thing, and they also eat a lot of insects. They rip apart logs and go after insects. And so instead of being able to find honey in nature, the zookeepers have brought honey to the bear. They call it enrichment, but it makes the animals entertaining for little kids on spring break. Don't feed the bears, right? That's what we say. So this is my lead into earthworms. Okay, so do you need to go put earthworms out, or can you give them the right habitat and will they flourish? That answer is really, you give them the right habitat and they'll come. So the no cover crop here, this is earthworms in a cubic yard, which that's kind of a funny unit. Usually, I'll show you another slide later. I usually measure them in a cubic foot. But anyway, the units here are a little weird. But you can still see the no cover crop, that's maybe less than 100. The late maturing soybean, there was about 300. And the sun hemp was, over 400. Okay, so that's really different. So I just told you about infiltration. Notice that pattern is the same as this pattern, and it's the same as this pattern, right? So is the better infiltration because of the organic matter? Is it because of the infiltration? Or is it because of the earthworms? I'm not sure, but they're all tied together. They're all tied to each other. So yes, so build it, the earthworms come. Here's what's kind of neat about this is we were out there in December of 2009. This is before it froze. It was still nice out at this point. we were out there digging these up in grain sorghum stalks. So if you think about it, it had been grain sorghum all of 2009, you know, basically the growing season. And so it was 2008 when the cover crops were grown after a wheat. So if you do the math of maybe 13, 14 months is when the sun hemp and the soybean were growing most actively. And so when we're out there in December 2009, that's where they still wanted to be. And these aren't just huge strips. In other words, the worms probably could migrate from plot to plot, but they didn't. They stayed over here. So the infiltration was better. So if there was a hard rain, you know, worms come up during rain because they need to get oxygen, so they come up and then they go back down. But they need this infiltration, or, you know, this good infiltration capacity. It just was a better habitat over there for them. So, oh yes, and Darwin really liked worms as well. So he made observations about them. Excellent manner for the growth of fibrous rooted plants and for seedlings of all kinds. So earthworms, they're great from a production standpoint as well. They stimulate microbial activity. They're kind of like us, right? So we consume some microbes when we eat, right? But many more microorganisms pass out in their feces or casts than what they consume. So that means they've got microbes in their gut. They fragment and inoculate soil. They fragment organic matter and they inoculate that with microorganisms. And because of some of this, people have taken soil. So you could actually do this as well. Go out in your fields if you've got a lot of earthworm casts. I've seen pictures on Twitter, so you know who you are. But go pick up some earthworm casts and sample them, and then maybe pick up some soil like that's kind of in the neighborhood. I would call that the bulk soil versus the earthworm cast. See for yourself, is it higher? So Edwards and others saw that it was higher in NP and K than the soil. And then I just found this the other night and was reading it. So it's a kind of a big paper on all the good things about earthworms, and was talking about they increase mineral nitrogen and readily exchangeable phosphorus. So this is another study somebody else did. They found that there was more exchangeable phosphorus, more potassium, calcium, and magnesium in their casts. And so there's a very positive relationship between productivity and earthworms, but they do have to be fed. They need that habitat to be prolific. So this is one where I did this with other people, haven't written it up yet. So this is, this is at Ottawa, Kansas. So this is in eastern Kansas. And it's a corn and soybean rotation with cover crops in it. And these would be fall planted, right? So a lot of these cooler season plants. And so if you're looking at this and you're looking at the purple bars, which one's the best, which one's worse? Do I really think rye is worse than the radish, or rye worse, you know, like you have rye plus radish? Basically, I haven't really dug into the stats a lot, but I wanted to show is that kind of a number that we throw around is, if you see more than 10 in a cubic foot, that's really quite good. And so 10 is sort of a threshold. Anywhere from 1 to 10 is still, that's pretty okay. If you see 0, well, that tells you something. But, you know, if you see a lot of earthworm casts or earthworm burrows, maybe you just aren't sampling at the right time. So good time to go sample this is like fall, after harvest, or spring. Like, can't go out when it's too wet, but sometime before planting, go dig up some soil and do some counting. You wouldn't want to do it in one spot. You probably need to do it in a few spots. So there are, so if you're like, oh, the mix is the best, well, I'm not going to say that yet. I need to do a little more digging into my own data. But it's very interesting work. I think it's very interesting and fun work to do, is to go looking at earthworms. And what do they prefer? Okay, so I'm going to talk about soil structure and aggregation. And just as a visual, the one on the left is very well aggregated. It might look a little cloddy here, but the water would flow right through this soil. So it's not a compacted soil. It's just really tightly aggregated. And then this one is from right over the fence, a burned wheat field that's continuously, continuous wheat and lots of tillage. And I'm actually shocked that the color is as dark as it is on that. But the structure was just, there would be water ponding on it on a day like today. Okay, so wet aggregate measurement. Now we actually do it with a machine in my lab with sieves and stuff, but I just want to show you the visual. So these are those soils. So conventional, no-till native. Got the little PEDs, pretty equal size sitting there, and then drop them in the water. And what do? Well, the conventional kind of starts to slake off a little bit. A chunk is, kind of come off right here. And this is no-till, and there's a little air bubble there in the native, so they don't look much different. And then I just picked it up and swirled each one about one time, one swirl, and the conventional till just completely came apart. This no-till, there's that same air bubble, really didn't move. It's very well aggregated, it all stuck together, and this is the native. So am I trying to say we need to go from here, you know, are we ever going to get to the native condition? I would say, well, probably not, because where this is sampled, this has been a grassland for a few thousand years at least, if not longer. And so that's a condition that's, you know, we're just not probably going to get to. But can we try? Can we try to get closer, especially in the surface, especially in that top few inches? And I didn't say this on that slide with the organic matter, but there wasn't any difference in the 3 to 6 inch depth. It was all about that top depth, that top 3 inches. I think of that as a gatekeeper. That gets crusted over, it's done. You know, you just don't get much water in the soil. So this, I'm going to show you some aggregate stability stuff that we did in the lab, but I just wanted that to be a visual. So, but why did this fall apart so bad? It's not that this doesn't have any pores. It just doesn't have any long, continuous pores. So imagine that there's this one on the left. It's just, it doesn't have any long pores like a big earthworm burrow or an old root that kind of went continuously through it. Instead, it's all been disturbed several times. So it has pores, but they're all kind of little circular ones that might be inside that chunk of soil that we call PEDs. Well, imagine if you drop something in water that's got a whole bunch of air pockets, where does the air want to go? The air wants to get out. And in this case, this aggregate exploded. We do this in soils lab. This is an exploding aggregate. The air wanted out. It didn't have any pathways. Like this one, this no-till, it had a big crack in it of some kind, not just a crack, but some kind of stable crack. It didn't fall apart. The air bubbled out slowly and got out, so water can get in. It's also important for soils to have some good, long, continuous pores, so that oxygen can diffuse into the soil, because roots and microbes need oxygen. Carbon dioxide can get out of the soil. And then again, over here, there really is no change. Quite very, very stable. Okay, so we did this experiment. And so Olathe is over, that's in the Kansas City area for any non-Kansans on the call. And so in this particular study, the control was 2 tillage operations that were very aggressive. So a fall tillage and a spring tillage prior to planting vegetables. So in this system, that's kind of why they call it the control, is maybe that's sort of something that in the past has been common. But what if you add in a fall cover and a spring cover? So I'll show you this. Well, the fall covers all had rye in them. There was 6 different ones with rye, and there was 2 different ones that had oats. So there was straight rye and straight oats. Now, my graduate student, Catherine Davis, this was part of her thesis, and so she prepared a lot of nice graphs. And what she really found was that the cover crop didn't really matter. It was more the presence of a cover crop or not. So which cover crop didn't really matter. So, okay, what are we looking at? Well, there's no little letters over the top of any of these, and that means that there's no statistical differences between like the 3 bars in this grouping. But what I want you to look at is total aggregation. So these 3 numbers are not different from each other at all. Even if this one's a little taller, trust me, it's variability, it's not. So the first year, so cover crops, these had been planted one time. So there had been cover crops planted in the fall of 2012. They had been terminated in the spring. A vegetable crop was grown, and then we soil sampled. So after 1 year of having a cover crop in there one time, no difference. This is the next year. So now cover crops had been planted 2 total times, 2 vegetable crops have been grown, and we soil sampled again. And now there's supposed to be these little letters and these p-values here, which means scientifically or mathematically, these numbers we're very confident. We're a high level of confidence. More than 95% sure that these 2 numbers are different from like this number and this number are different. Okay, so greater than 4.75. Imagine a crouton on your salad. It's kind of those small ones, not the huge ones, but some small croutons. That's about the size they are, 4.75 millimeters to 8 millimeters. So they're big, fairly big. And Those are the big aggregates. And then they kind of go down in size from there. And then this small, these are like really tiny. This is basically the, really, this is the leftover. This is what makes that water cloudy, right? So just like as I showed you in that beaker, this water is cloudy. This is the control. It just had poor aggregation. So it's actually easier to just look at the total aggregation and show that the fall cover had the most aggregation, which is good. We want more aggregates. And then the spring planted cover had a little bit less, and then the control had none, and that would have been my hypothesis, that the control would have had none. Okay, then what happened after one more year? So this is now after 3 cover crop cycles. We have differences, pretty much across the board. Now look at the bigger ones, those biggest ones, the fall cover and the spring cover didn't really matter. They both grouped out totally different than the 4.7, than this control. So it had less big aggregates. Go over here on the small aggregates, or the stuff that's not aggregates, the cloudy water, it's got more. And then the total aggregation, they group differently. So in this case, after that first time, I thought, oh, well, maybe fall is better than spring. But then actually, throughout the rest of the experiment, all the other times they sampled, it really didn't matter if it was fall or spring cover. Cover was cover, and it was good for the soil. Yeah, so that's Olathe, and I forgot to say that this is a silt loam soil. This is what you want to farm. This is a really nice silt loam soil, and so point of this one is we could pick up some differences in aggregation after just a year. Oh wait, not 1 year, 2 years. After 2 to 3 years, we saw a difference. So after 2 years at Olathe, there's one site. Okay, Wichita. This is a loamy fine sand. So this is not sand, but a loamy fine sand, so it just barely gets your hand a little bit dirty. If you get some in your hand, work it up like a texture ball, brush off your hand just barely gets dirty. And so here, control, fall cover, spring cover. Again, this is after one cycle. There's only letters here, and this is, I can't really explain that too much why this is that way, but you can see there's no difference in the big aggregates, no difference in the small, no difference in the total, just no difference after 1 year on a sandy soil. And there's really no difference after 2 years on a sandy soil, which doesn't surprise me because it has less physical protection. And this is, I forgot, I wasn't going to actually put the spring in there, but maybe I left it in there because I wanted to say after 2.5 cycles of growing cover crops, we saw a big difference. So this was spring, so, this one, the control hardly had any big aggregates, and the fall and the spring, they both had a lot. And again, this non-aggregated cloudy water stuff, and then a big difference here. So a very pronounced difference. And this is a site that kind of needs cover crop, and I'll show you why in a little bit. This is a good thing to have a cover crop on a sandy soil. And let's see, this is fall again. So fall, big differences. So maybe after 2 years on that silt loam, and after 2.5 years on the sandier soil, this is important. Why is this important? This is important for water moving into the soil. Let's see. I'll talk about the water in just a second, but this is the microbial biomass carbon. So I really haven't talked a ton about microbes or shown you any data on microbes yet. This project that we did, this vegetable project, the lead scientist on this is a vegetable grower, or he's a vegetable scientist, and he's stationed at our Olathe site. His name is Kerry Rivard, in case you're interested. And he brought me in because he was like, I want to measure the soil properties. Would you do that part of it? I'm like, okay, sure. Soil is soil, cover crops, and I'm in. That's kind of cool. And so in this case, we also had a microbiologist, Peter Tomlinson, work on this project with us as well. So this is one of the measurements he does. So microbial biomass carbon, what you do is you take soil, you add chemicals, you dissolve the bodies of the microbes and take them out. Okay, so, and then you measure how much carbon was there. So there's other tests you can do where you take you can take a jar, like the Solvita test. You can take a jar of soil, add in a Solvita paddle, and measure how much carbon dioxide is given off by that soil in 24 hours. And so that's a different thing. That's microbial respiration. And they're all kind of measure different things. There's phospholipid, fatty acid analysis. You've heard of PLFA, perhaps. That can tell you who's in your soil, how much fungi, how much bacteria, how much protozoa, and things like that. So there's different ways to measure it. But microbial biomass carbon, basically, it tells you about the mass. I think about this as farming microbes, and so there's more mass. Okay, so here I've shown you all the different treatments. So this is the tillage, and notice how it has the least amount of biomass. Oh yeah, here's the units. So it's a mass of how many microbes there were per a mass of soil. So it was the least. And what I need to do is eventually average these numbers like I did on the other ones for what is it, no cover versus cover, or fall versus spring, and that stuff. Didn't do it yet, but you can see there, these numbers are quite high. They are different. Now, the p-value here, if I want to compare between all of these, says there's no difference. But like I said, if I average these 7, I think there'd be a difference. Now, I put the Olathe and the Wichita side by side. Okay, this is the sandy one, so loamy fine sand. It's sandier, so I would hypothesize by what I've been taught in textbooks that this would be lower, just because there's, not as much good habitat in a sandy soil as there is in a silty soil for, niches for the microbes to be. I'd hypothesize this, but also that you get what you get as far as water content. So which one of these is probably going to be drier? Well, usually the Wichita, the sandy one's going to be drier. So in a drier soil, I expect less microbes than I do in a wetter soil. Okay, now I will say, oh, cool. Yes, Catherine did this. I forgot. The cover, these covers versus the no cover is significant. I was too lazy to make the graph, but it is significant. And thank you, Catherine, for doing that. But yeah, so that is significant. So that's pretty cool. Now, why is microbial biomass cool? Why do you want more microbes? More microbes is probably going to equal more nutrient cycling. That's what they do. They break down tissue and they can cycle that. So that's a good thing as far as crop production is. And if you're like, well, this is a vegetable experiment, it doesn't matter what you grow. I'll show you in a second. It looks the same, but it's how they plant it and how they harvest it's a little bit different. But basically, everything else is pretty similar. Fertilizer, irrigation, whatever. Okay, so let's see. This is the spring of 2015. So yeah, that was the spring of 14. This is spring of 15. Same kind of thing you got going on here. Amber, I heard you maybe click on there, but same kind of thing I see here is that there's a huge difference between these two soil types and big influence of soil moisture at sampling. And so again, less microbial biomass than there is in the sandy soil than there is in the siltloam soil. And so what about infiltration? This is that sandy soil, again, just showing you Wichita. There's a lot of times that I go out and pound rings in the soil and I don't see treatment differences. It happens pretty frequently. And I think that's just because there's so much variability. Where you put that ring down. Is that where a tire track ran 2 years ago that you can't see anymore, but it might be there? It's hard to say. So I'm not surprised when I don't see big differences. But this is an example where I did. And so that was one of these days where you go out there and this soil, the sandy soil, was hard as a rock. And if you've ever sampled a sandy soil, it seems like, oh yeah, that should sample pretty easy. Well, it depends. If it's moist or wet, sample's great. If it's dry, it's horrible. And so this was one of these days where this conventional teal was just sealed off really hard. It was very flat, very hard. And, but push those rings in carefully. You don't want to make a big mess when you push them in. You got to push them in kind of perfectly down so that you're not, creating much cracks when you pound them in. And so this is 20. So in this case, the tall bar is bad because it's minutes to infiltrate 1 inch of ponded water. So 25 minutes to infiltrate an inch of water is not that great. And you can see the big difference here. And if I had sprinkled or rained water on top of this might even be worse because this one would probably really seal over, as if you've ever really watched, but rain impact, right? The rain impacts the soils. The raindrops are hitting the soil at a very high rate of speed relative to the size of the particle. And over here, in a rainstorm event, you'd have physical protection. It would take a lot of the energy off. But you can see even when you're ponding it, a huge difference that the cover crops had. And one of those reasons is because of soil moisture. These were a little more moist than this one, and you could just really slide the ring in better. And yeah, so aggregates matter. So aggregates matter, and cover matters. a lot. Oh yeah, so I said, loamy fine sand soil, hard as a rock. The others were friable. And in this case, the crop that year was, at this project, was pumpkins. And so botanically, I don't know the right word for what they are, but you know what I mean when I say runners, right? So the secondary vines coming off the main vine of the pumpkin, they put down roots from those vines. And they need to find a soil that's friable. So it's a good thing that they can find some soil that they can get down, some pores that are open, not sealed off. So from a production standpoint, it's a good thing. And I haven't shown you a picture what this looks like yet, but I'm just going to remind you, ET, evapotranspiration. E is coming from the soil, which is basically a waste, and T is going through the plant. Transpiration, we need that. Plants need that, right? Otherwise they wilt. So they need access to soil moisture. Transpiration is good. So here's a picture of what this looks like. So this is way early in the season, and this is black drip tape. This is cereal rye rolled down, and we had some mixes. You saw that on one of the other slides. So, but this one looks like it might be cereal rye to me. I took that so long ago, I kind of forgot what it is. But you can see what a great job that's going to do at reducing that solar radiation. So a lot of the radiation is going to be reflected. There's not, when you're walking on these, this is where you want to walk. It's so much cooler. And this is good for pumpkin production in terms of marketability. So the vegetable guy on this project, he's done all those measurements, but it's my understanding that there's less big yellow spots. It's more attractive to people. These were jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, so it's all about the look, right? So, and then I told you about how I like those old books. And you can mail me your old books. That would be amazing. But this says a temperature of 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit is found most favorable to the production of a maximum fermentative activity. And this chapter was called Ferments Important in Agriculture, Yearbook of the USDA, 1895. So 1895, they knew about the effect of soil temperature on microbes. So that's what they're talking about, right? Fermentation, decomposition by microbes. You know, at that time, thinking about soil microbes as doing work, you know, it was kind of a new thing. But back in 1895, they knew the importance of microbial activity and talking about the temperature range. So once it gets above 100, there's not as much activity, and you know, again, 85 to 100 is pretty good, and we still see pretty good microbial activity. You know, even under 80, like 50 to 80 is pretty good. Below 50, it kind of starts to, you know, slow down a bit. Eventually, it gets too cold. But and this is like a little bit later in the season before it completely closed over. But again, it's actually doing a pretty good job of weed control. This looks like a little cereal rye that sprouted here. And yeah, so holding down weeds, it really does a pretty good job. There are weeds, though. There are some. And so it's not just a perfect system. It's not perfect, but I think about how that might affect, you know, the weed seed bank. Well, there's not as many weeds there producing seeds for the future. There's you know, there's so many good things about this, but if I think about herbicide resistance, and I'm no weed scientist, but could this hold off, like prolong the life of herbicides before we get, you know, new herbicide-resistant weeds? I don't know. I think it's a good thing to at least put in the rotation somewhere. Oh yeah, so this is I had a little Twitter quiz going on about, you know, vitality of the soil and how long ago did somebody comment about soil health. And so this has same Yearbook of Ag, that fermentative thing, vitality. So soil health, that's not a new concept. We just didn't, you know, really call it that. But vitality of the soil. I just love that. And I used the Twitter cards from or Pokemon cards from my kids to kind of block out some of those details so people couldn't just find it on the internet. They had to guess the year. So here's some yield data on this. And again, you're like, oh, I'm not really interested in pumpkins. So, well, that's okay. It's sort of the same relationship. And I want to show that. Okay, so what does this say? Well, this is megagrams per hectare, which is pretty close to tons per acre. That's like 1.1 tons per acre. So it's pretty close. So imagine 40 tons in an acre-ish of the pumpkins. That's a lot of pumpkins. But so tillage was the highest, but it really was actually the same as a rye-vetch mixture. So if you're a pumpkin producer, if you're a vegetable producer, and you've never used cover crops before, you want to know, like, is this going to impact my yield? Is it going to be negative? Is it going to be positive? Is it going to save me some input costs? Is it going to save me some herbicide? These are all the questions you want to know, right? But so that's pretty cool that the rye vetch was the same. You're like, wow, some of these others were worse. Well, we didn't do a good job with nitrogen management this year. And so all that rye biomass, for example, we didn't supply enough nitrogen. So that's why the tilled soil was better. There was just, in this case, because there was not enough nitrogen applied to sort of compensate for the fact that microbes are going to do work. They're trying to break down that high carbon biomass, and so they need some nitrogen to go along with that. So we didn't supply the right amount of nitrogen here. Now, the next 2 years, we got better at that. We used a fertigation system, and we really were on top of it. And that's one of the things Carrie does a lot of education on is fertigation and getting people comfortable with that and teaching them how to do it. And so you can see now, if you just focus in on the orange bars for 2014, it wasn't as good of a year for growing pumpkins overall. But you can see, okay, tillage was here, but there's some other oh, and there's no letters over this, so statistically, these things were all the same. The p-value is 0.22. We like to see that low, under 0.05 to be really sure. This is like a confidence thing. These things, there's just not any difference. So like whether it was oats or whether it was rye canola, those two numbers aren't statistically different. So basically, if I rolled the dice or if I went to the next farm over and try the same thing, and I was like, like if I was saying, oh, rye pea, that looks great compared to rye, I go to the next farm over, it might be just the opposite, right? So my point is like if you ever see a taller bar and you're like, I don't care about statistics, well, you should, because it tells you something about how often you might get that result, how frequently. Okay, so 15 was a little bit better year across the board for pumpkins, and there was no statistical difference. So what's this mean? If you've never used cover crops before and you're a vegetable grower or any kind of farmer, it doesn't matter, you might say, okay, great. So cover crops, I did this, there was no yield penalty. Now, one thing I haven't told you that I think is pretty cool about the whole project is this. The tillage system was tilled 2 times per year, every year, 3 years of study. I didn't tell you this, but the other cover crops, these other 7 treatments, they were tilled vigorously 1 time per year. So when I was asked to participate in the study, and they're like, hey, it's no-till, vegetables, Great Plains, cover crops. Okay, cool. I figured they meant never till. And then once we got into the project, we were like, no, we got to till 1 time. We got to till 1 time. It's not no-till permanently. Like, oh, all right, well, that's not what agronomy people call no-till. And they're like, well, I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. Well, it is semantics. But do you get my point that the fact that there was differences in soil properties with the cover crops were beneficial to soil properties even when it was tilled up 1 time per year. So if you're curious when it was tilled up, it gets tilled up right after they harvest a crop, and then they till it all up, then they planted cover crops, then they rolled those cover crops down like you saw in the picture, and then they planted the pumpkins. So the pumpkins were no-tilled into a rolled down roller crimper cover crop. And I'm about done. If you're thinking, this is going long, I'm almost done. We got the best weed control with the cover crops in 2013, and it was good in 14, and it was fair to poor in 15. We still got pretty good yields, but it was kind of starting to be fair to poor. So I think weed pressure just differs from year to year. So conclusions on this pumpkin thing is this, that short term, there were several instances while reducing tillage. Again, it wasn't permanent no-till, it was no-tilled, or the pumpkins were no-tilled in. So 1 tillage per year versus 2 aggressive tillages per year. So several instances where that tillage and the cover crops to a pumpkin production system improved water-stable soil aggregation versus the control. And it was actually, this should say 2 to 2.5 years. So I don't know why I said 2 to 2.5 years. And once we managed it right, that is, once we started fertigating, there was no positive or negative effect on the pumpkin yield. Now, some properties maybe yield, and because of the soil, they're tending to take longer to change, or they might be a lot of variability, and they depend on recent soil temperature and moisture conditions. So that's why a lot of times, if you want to nail scientists down on how often, is this going to increase yield? Well, there's a lot of things that go into yield, right? There's a lot of things. What is the most limiting thing that year on yield? So now, I will say So the methods we talked about the methods to improve soil. Cover crops can be used in systems that are no-tilled or tilled, right? No, I'm not saying I advocate tillage. I'm just simply saying that there were benefit in tilled systems too, and they lead to improvements in the soil. Now, will those improvements in the soil lead to increased profit for a farmer? Will the effort pay for itself or increase profits long term? Because, I mean, in theory, you should have better soils that should equal better productivity and better yields over time. Now, I didn't show you the yield from that Heston study, the one with the sun hemp and the soybean, but there actually was a small increase in productivity with that cover crop after 15 years, after several years. So I believe that as soil are improved, it will lead to productivity. I just don't know that's going to be on our time scale that we as humans are interested in. I think it's going to take a little longer. So another takeaway point I'd like to say from that is there was a big benefit of having a cover crop in there every other year. So I think finding a cover crop that fits well into your system, or even if you want to make a little wiggle room to make one fit into your system, finding it in the right place in your rotation is important, I think. Then I also think that there's a spatial thing too. Like there are probably some fields that you have that could use a cover crop more desperately than others. And so that's what I would encourage people to think about is I have a story about a guy called me last year and said, I'm not interested in cover crops one bit, never been, but I can't stand it. I've been watching last year for May was really wet for us. I can't stand it. We've had just terrible erosion. I'm literally, I can't, there's just terrible gullies in my field. I'm no-till, there's terraces, and I can't take it. And so, when we talked about low-hanging fruit for him, he wasn't interested in going whole hog or crazy or anything. And I was like, well, some people in Nebraska are starting to just put like oats or cereal rye, just drilling that into those areas that tend to wash. Think of it as like temporary waterways. And he was like, oh, I like that idea. And he was going to go try that. So, spatially, even just focusing effort, focusing resources, especially when years are tight, I think something's better than nothing. Grazing, that's another way to monetize and allow pastures to rest. So as far as picking a cover crop, Midwest Cover Crops Council has a great tool for picking a cover crop, and you'll have to look at the states that are on there. They tend to be the Midwest states, but Kansas is also on there too. We worked and put a bunch of information together so that we could say intelligent things about different crops and say, but you can put in your location, your cash crop, and when you plant that and stuff, and then you have to pick your objectives. And so the objectives would be weed control, nitrogen fixation, whatever, and there's ratings for each thing. And so it's kind of interactive because you can watch them sort of get grayed out. And let's see. And this is, you can't have a presentation without some soils. And this is an earthworm burrow, kind of a close-up version. So yeah, if I wanted to take the time and scrape that soil off, I know that there would be a little bit more nutrients right there on the outside than there is on the inside of the soil. And also that's some vetch with some really pretty nodules there. And so I'm going to conclude here.